Welcome everybody to our Open Online Briefing of April the 28th. Thank you for finding the time to join. I want today to reflect on some of the exchanges I've had with several of you who are trying to respond to COVID in really quite challenging settings where you don't have all the resources that you need to do what one might call the ideal response, but you're trying to do the best you can with what you have. And I'd like to start by stressing that for everybody in the world right now, there's a massive sense-making exercise going on. Everyone everywhere is having to work out in their own mind, what is this virus? And what does it mean to live with it as a threat that's likely to stick with us for the months and years to come? It's not suddenly going to go away. We're not going to have a magic cure. And it will be some months, probably years, before there's a vaccine that has the potential to protect everybody against it. So we've got to learn to live with it. And it's going to stay a threat to all of us, everywhere. So in order for people to make sense of it, I feel there's an awful lot of conversations underway right now. How do we live with this virus? What changes do we have to make? How's our social life going to change? How's our work going to change? How are we going to be able to operate? And people all over the world, some in very, very poorer situations than I'm in, are having to work this out. And in working it out, first thing is that, of course, we don't have answers to all the questions that we're asking. We ask ourselves, if you get the virus, are you then immune and not going to get it again? Or is it true that only older people and people with other diseases get really ill from this virus? Or how do we best make certain that we can protect sections of the society who are more vulnerable? There are questions that are being answered in real time, because this is a new virus. We've only known about it for 4 months, and we learn about it as we're going. But we also have to learn how we deal with the virus and its threats in our own settings, making the best we can out of what we have. Even if we can't follow all the guidance that's coming now from governments and others about the right way to reduce the threat, what can we do if we just don't have all the things that they say? And so what I've been doing is listening to people around the world talk to me about the way in which they're trying to tackle it, the way in which they're trying to deal with the virus, and the way in which they're trying to react to the effects of the virus on their lives and their livelihoods. And I thought I'd share with you some of what I'm hearing. It'll come perhaps initially as a set of questions that I'm hearing, but then I'm going to share with you some of what people are telling me in answers to these questions. Because I actually do think that now more than ever is a time for sharing experiences, learning from one another. Goodness me, if we try to do this alone in our own city, in our own country, or in our own section of the world, we're going to get totally overwhelmed, because this is such a big series of challenges that it really does require the whole human family working together to solve them. Solidarity matters. First set of questions I'm hearing is, how do we protect ourselves and others from being infected? We know that the right way to do it is hygiene, washing our hands, making sure that the surfaces we use are well cleaned, and then perhaps also protecting ourselves with a tissue or a cloth when we cough or sneeze, and then trying to make certain also that perhaps we protect our faces with face coverings, so that if we've got the virus but we don't know how seriously ill we are, we can still protect others. What happens if we don't have water at home? If we don't have soap? If we have to go outside to the toilet? If we have to really go up close to people because we have to care for them, we have no way of protecting ourselves? Or if we want to protect ourselves but we can't get the masks that everybody says are the right masks, How do we manage then? We have to improvise. And I'm hearing of people improvising on hand washing, using sometimes no more than 100 milliliters of water for each hand wash, not with a nice free running tap, with a tiny bar of soap or just with ash to wash with. I'm hearing of people who don't have nice hand sanitizers or surface cleaners and are having to try to clean their surfaces just with a cloth or not much more than just a single cloth. And I'm hearing people talk about how they can't get masks, even for health workers. They're having to make face protectors using patterns that they get from the internet. Fortunately, there are more and more available. And I'm saying, yep, please go on. Please go on trying to find ways in your own circumstances where you can reduce the risk of being infected by maintaining physical distance, by using cough etiquette, by cleaning surfaces, and by trying to make certain that you do wash your hands, but adapt it to your own circumstances. Find ways to wash your hands with a tiny volume of water. Keep your surfaces clean even when you haven't got the hand sanitizers and the cleaning fluids, because that is what really matters. I'll try another example. How do we identify people with COVID when there's no way to test them? Because there are no tests, because where we live, there is no testing. Actually, that applies to more than 2/3 of the world right now. Most of the countries where COVID is advancing have very limited testing. So people everywhere are having to learn to live with this threat by actually working on the basis of symptoms. If they can see what symptoms are associated, if they know what symptoms are associated with COVID, they can actually help people to isolate on the basis of having a fever and a dry cough and some shortness of breath, perhaps preceded by a day or so of loss of smell and taste, with perhaps some rashes on the back of the hand or the back of the front of the foot, and perhaps a white finger or two. These are all the kind of patterns of symptoms that are associated with COVID. They're not perfect. We know that some people with COVID don't have those symptom collections that are known, but it's better than nothing. It's better to be able to work out that you might have COVID on the basis of your symptoms, and either to isolate yourself or to be told by your family member, come on, go, get isolated. Say, look after us, protect us by keeping out of our way. That may well be more and more what has to happen. And it's kind of particularly important if you have to wait for a test for 2 or 3 days. During that time, while you've got your symptoms, you could be highly infectious, because all the evidence is that people who have this virus are most infectious early on in their illness, before their major symptoms appear. So it's really important that everybody everywhere gets into the habit of self-isolating. The moment they have even the slightest threat of symptoms, if they can then get tested to confirm whether or not they should be isolating, that's really useful. But the important thing is to isolate quickly and isolate properly. And in addition, to make sure that you do protect others in your household. So people tell to me, how can I isolate, David, if there's nowhere in our house where we can actually hide away? Because we only live in one room. We sleep in that room. We cook in that room. Our children play in that room. That's where we do everything. How can we isolate in one room? And of course, it's impossible. And so then what happens is that the whole household has to be ready to isolate. But then I get people telling me, and this has come particularly from some very densely populated communities in Asia and in Africa, hey, actually, even for households to isolate, it's difficult. And so I'm hearing of really imaginative plans coming for sections of communities to isolate themselves, to establish systems where food can be brought to them, where there are discrete latrines prepared for the people in the isolated areas so they don't have to mingle with others, where they're given the water that they need for personal hygiene and for other purposes and cooking. And they're given the firewood if they're dependent on firewood for their cooking. But they are essentially kept in a protected way. Yes, they're isolated, but they're also cared for by others in the community. And that's happening. And it's happening in many, many places right now because it's so hard for individuals to isolate. So therefore, we move to a point where actually sections of communities isolate. And then I'm hearing also of one other area. People say to me, okay, you tell us we've got to isolate, but you're also saying we've got to do case finding and contact tracing, i.e. we've got to find the contacts of people who've been infected and we've got to then ask them to isolate as well. But David, you know, we don't know who we've been in contact with for the past few days. We've been moving around. It's very difficult. So I said, okay, I understand, but you've got to understand that this disease does spread through close contact and through the spread of droplets that come from a cough or a sneeze or just talking or breathing or even singing. And so over time, people say, okay, I get it. And they say, well, I think what we'll do is we'll tell you the people we've been close to for about 15 minutes or half an hour, except they don't necessarily use those times. But at least we're starting to get to who have been the main close contacts. And then the number becomes clear. And I'm hearing of really incredible work, particularly in Mumbai, Maharashtra, in India, of extraordinary work by community volunteers working with local health workers, doing the case finding. And not only that, they're finding that actually many of the new cases that are detected in their particular area come from these traced contacts. And that means that they are really doing a good job, because in order to interrupt transmission, to trace the contacts and to isolate them is a key way of getting on top of the virus. So there are 4 examples: preventing ourselves when we haven't got much water or soap or other facilities, identifying people with COVID when we haven't got tests, isolating when we haven't got space in our households within which to isolate, tracing contacts when we haven't got all the necessary attributes to be able to find contacts and contact them and get in touch with them, tell them what to do. And we have to do it using local methods. These are ways in which communities all over the world are getting COVID ready, but they're doing it within the kind of capacities that they have in their local areas. I'm actually filled with confidence about this. When I was working in East Africa on Ebola in 2014, I was in Liberia, and I was talking, and this is name dropping now, with the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and it was early August, and she was really, really fed up and depressed. And I remember her looking up at me and saying, David, it feels as though the rest of the world has forgotten us, that we're here with our Ebola and we're struggling and people are dying. We see bodies on the streets and in communities, and we feel forgotten. I remember saying to her, well, yeah, actually, I can understand that, but I'm here representing the Secretary General of the United Nations. And she looked up and she smiled. And I saw her the next day, and she had a beaming smile on her face. I said, what's happened, President? And she said, I just had this call from the President of the USA. And he rang and he said just a few words, but his central words were, the people of the United States are with you, madam. We're going to help. And it had such an effect on her. It lifted her spirits enormously. And I remember within hours, she was calling together the leaders from the different counties in the country. And she said to them, come on, we can beat this. We know that this Ebola is spreading through what we do when we've got sick people and we do laying on hands. And we know that this Ebola is spreading because when we have funerals, we lie all over the bodies of people who died to try to make sure that their spirits go to a good place and not a bad place. But we also know, friends, that this behavior is actually leading to the spread of this virus, and it's causing such terrible misery in our country. And we've had this big man from the United States ringing us and saying he's with us. Let's show us that we're with ourselves. And inspired, she then got these community leads to act and county after county after county, we saw and heard how people were coming together and saying, we're going to change the way in which we do funerals. We're going to change the way in which we heal the sick. We're going to change the way in which we bury our bodies, because we know that if we do that, we ourselves can reduce the risk of Ebola. And I saw it happening, and gradually, county by county, the numbers started to drop. And then we saw in other countries nearby, again, the same thing happened, but it tended to be slower in the counties where there was discord between different political factions, or there was communal disagreements. So important that there was that leadership, that strong encouragement, that inspiration for people to act and to use their ingenuity. But the big lesson from that was, if you can hand this issue over to the people, they will find their ways of dealing with it. If you keep it just with the authorities, then there's not that release of responsibility and that capacity for people to themselves be in charge of their own destiny. And I am watching this happen with COVID. It's much, much tougher than Ebola. The issues are more complex. There's lots of uncertainties. There's decisions that are tricky to work through. There's a lot of anticipation you've got to do. There's a huge need to really articulate what we're trying to achieve. And then as soon as we do that, we have to adapt our strategies. And we all the time have to be accountable for what we're doing. But provided that people everywhere can be given the space and opportunity to work through what this means, then they themselves can take responsibility. So I've shared these feelings with you today because I've really become convinced that for the majority of the world, finding ways to live with the threat of COVID in our midst is not something that somebody else is going to do for them. It's something that's going to come from inside. It's something that's going to come from a willingness to work with others to find better ways to defend against this ever-present threat. It's going to be finding ways to accept that from time to time, when there are sudden outbreaks that will occur, that there will be a necessity for movement to be restricted and for things to be closed down. Finding ways to be totally understanding that this will be the way in which the threats will be managed, health services will be preserved, and widespread death will be prevented. Finding ways to make sure that when these actions are put in place, poorer people are not forced to go on the streets begging for food because they're suddenly out of work, but to put in place very quickly the necessary protection mechanisms for poorer people, because dealing with COVID, particularly responding to outbreaks when they start to really kind of explode, does require movement restriction, does require a degree of localized lockdown. And for that, there has to be a social contract between people and the state. And it's a reciprocal one, but it's where the state has a huge role in working for the public good. And that's what public health is about. So those are my remarks today. I just thought, having said those opening comments, I just stress to you, all of you who've joined this call, that yes, this virus is continuing to spread all over the world. Yes, it is challenging people, health systems, governments all over the world. Just because there is talk about the outbreak curve being flattened in some advanced countries or richer countries, that doesn't mean it's gone away anywhere. And in poorer countries, there are huge and difficult struggles underway, and they're really, really serious. Much more serious than for some people in better off countries. I also want to stress that in advanced nations where governments are struggling to find ways to help people emerge from lockdown, there are also some major challenges with what will be the longer term future. Is it going to be possible for the necessary public health defenses to be put in place so that everybody everywhere is defended against the threat of outbreaks restarting? Or is this going to be just too difficult? I hear reports from the United States, reports from the UK, reports from France, from Spain, from Italy, from Germany, Austria, Denmark, all during the last 2 or 3 days, really intense efforts to put strong community-based public health capacity in place and to get it working so that everybody everywhere can be able to defend themselves against this new threat. And I'm hearing reports from other parts of the world where there's a real effort now to use existing community structures and programs so that they can be helpful, whether it's just the polio programs or the malaria programs or others, bearing in mind that if you switch people off one health issue and put them onto COVID, you've also got to make sure at the same time that you're not just creating a huge, huge weight of responsibility and need because the health services are diverted. So we really need to be very careful here. COVID is the revealer that is showing us multiple frailties in our existing systems, and they're being exposed everywhere, whether it's in employment, whether it's in care for the elderly, whether it's in food systems or in transport, whether it's in air travel or sea travel or land travel, or the way in which we organize our settlements, our lack of sanitation. There are just numerous systems challenges being exposed by COVID. And all of us have to remember that actually the only way to address these is by dealing with the collective of systems challenges together and not trying to say each challenge is dealt with one solution, the next challenge, another solution, the next challenge, another solution. This is a collective action for dealing with interconnected issues. And it starts at the place where we all live and work and eat and drink and have fun. That place, the place where we are, is the centerpiece from where the work has to be done. And although many of us are involved in different government programs or NGO programs and the like, the heart of the work that we do to be strong in the face of COVID and this threat, which applies to many of the other threats that we might face, is in that place, around our homes, around where we work, around where we socialize, around where our children are educated. It's working in place that it really matters. Now, thank you for the chance to say these words. I feel each time when I do these briefings, you get a different facet of my mood. And today it's very much focusing on the challenges of places where there's so much less than what exists. Here where we are now in France at the border with Switzerland, we are really having to learn from people who are dealing with COVID in places that are poor. They've got so much to show. And I'm really delighted with the many people who've talked to me about this recently. Some of you will know quite a lot about 4SD. Forgive me for what I'm about to say, because I do want to introduce a few of us to what we are. We're a team of people who've been working together now for a year or two on trying to encourage a form of systems leadership that refers to the people inside systems and the other living processes inside systems. And we call it living systems leadership. And in our team, which is trying to apply the principles of living systems leadership to the COVID situation, we have John Atkinson, who's our specialist on systems leadership, Thuy Nguyen, who helps us with all our communications, and much of what she's been doing relates to what you see on the website that many of you have used, and also these online briefings. On health issues, we depend hugely on Catherine Deland, who used to be in the World Health Organization. She's a lawyer and a long-term colleague. Joe Colombano has joined us, volunteering to come and be in our midst, figuratively at least. He is an economist who used to work in the UN system and still is very connected into that system. Magali Mardi deals with all our issues to do with scheduling and is deeply connected into the NGO movement. Saber Moumen handles our administration and connects us to his family and friends and community in Sousse in Tunisia. Julian Delemontex, who's an official in the commune nearby in Flen area, is also working with us as our business liaison consultant. And our managing director, who looks after everything, is Florence Lasben. I'd just like everybody in the team to take a figurative bow. Now would be the time in a meeting where I'd ask you all to stand up and give a wave. That's difficult to do on a thing like this, but those of you who are waving, thank you for everything you do. And today we have people connected from Tunisia, from Sousse. Shukran and welcome to all of you. And we send you the very best wishes for Ramadan. We have people here from Canada, from Vancouver. Welcome and thank you for joining us, presumably quite, I don't know what time it is. We have a colleague from Kathmandu in Nepal. Thank you, Tracy. It's lovely to see you. Colleague from Kathmandu in Nepal. Yes, Rojan, Namaskarji. Thank you very much indeed for being with us and for your wonderful connecting and sharing all these accounts from what you're seeing in Nepal as the Kanchas and the Didis try to cope with this challenge. It's really great to be connected to you. We have colleagues from, obviously from France, from all over France, colleagues from Switzerland. Thank you for being with us. And colleagues from the UK, from Scotland and Brighton and Rugby and Nottingham, and I'm sure many other parts of the UK. So it's great that we're connected, and we will go on. We will continue twice weekly offering these online briefings where we can, putting them on the web. We know that some of you find them useful. You extract from them. You use them to make perhaps videos, and one video that's using the results of an online briefing is on our website. And I understand that it's been viewed an enormous number of times. Perhaps Twee could remind me how many times it's been viewed, but it's also been made available in Arabic, in French, in Italian, and it's now being translated into Russian and into Chinese with subtitles. And that was just all from one of these online briefings. We didn't do a special thing for it. And Twee just liaised with a great group of producers who did it voluntarily. And I think they might be on the call. So thank you to you. And if I don't know who it is, but if it's Derek, just brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for just what you've managed to do. And it's wonderful to see the many thousands of people who have started now using that and applying it and sharing it in different countries, and we get the reports. And I also am so pleased that Nazim, who works in a music organization from the Gambia, has taken some of the essence from one of our briefings and also from one of the narratives that we produced, and has made a song. And that song, he's now done a music video of it, and it's about getting COVID ready. And we're so pleased with what's in that song because it's in his words, with his music. And we hope that we'll be able to use that as the soundtrack to one of these videos. It's just absolutely great. And we encourage everybody, whether you develop your own narratives out of these briefings and you start your own dialogues in your local areas, you stimulate the great conversation on what COVID is going to do. That's what this is all about. So important that any idea that we issue here, any proposition that we share, anything that we put out is great. And I hear that Nazim from the group that's been working on the video might well be on this briefing. Nazim, you are just great. You who've done the music, and Derek who's made the film. Thank you so much. There you are, Nazim. I can see you there. I'm giving you a wave. Just say hi if you like. It's just lovely to see you, man. There you go. Thank you very much indeed. Beautiful. We also wanted to say we've got colleagues from Canada, actually, not just from Vancouver, from Winnipeg and Manitoba. It's been wonderful talking to Canadian colleagues. They've been telling us what they've been doing. So now on to the questions. And just by the way, just to want to shift a quick thing in. There are a few members of my family here. I just saw quickly my brother flashed up. If you're here, lovely to see you. Thank you very much indeed. So now the questions. We don't always give the name of the questioner, but occasionally, if I recognize who it is, I'll just acknowledge. We read of so many people dying in residential homes. How can we care properly for our older people and those who look after them? I suppose that for me is one of the really big challenges that COVID has brought us. I think that the evidence of what happens when the virus gets into residential accommodation for older people is really distressing. Very large numbers of people getting ill and dying. And to protecting them is really, really difficult. They are highly vulnerable people. Often those who care for older people are on low salaries. They may work in several different residential homes in order to make ends meet, but also they have to go back to their families. They can't afford to go and stay in a hotel to keep isolated, and they don't want to anyway. Their income may well be supporting a whole family. So there are absolutely massive challenges in the current state of technology for helping ensure that older people in residential accommodation stay safe. What we're seeing more and more now is that in many residential facilities for older people, staff who feel ill have to take leave, and they have to take 14 days off. If they can get a test and the test negative, they can come back to work. But all too often they can't get tested because tests are in short supply. So they have to stay away for 14 days. And it's a terrible problem because there is a real shortage of staff in residential care facilities. So the people in the residential care institution are both at risk of the COVID and at risk because there's a shortage of staff to look after them. I don't have a simple solution. If there was a simple point of care virus diagnostic test where we could take a swab up the nose and then we could then dip it into a machine and we would get an answer within 15 minutes. Are you positive or not? That would revolutionize what happens in residential homes, particularly at that doorway when you have to press in the code and the buzzer goes and you can go in the door. You'd probably almost always have at the same time a virus checker to see whether or not you've got the virus. But the technology is not available. The companies tell me that it's not impossible, but the amount of venture capital involved is in hundreds of millions of dollars because it's a high risk thing to go into. But that point of care virus detection is essential for so many areas where there is contact between people. I was talking to a leader of a hotel chain recently, and his last question to me is, when are we going to have a test that we can use when people check in at our hotels? When are we going to have a test that we can offer to our staff so they know whether or not they got the virus? This is so important. But right now we don't have it, and we have to live in the present. We can't live in the fantasy. And so I believe the first thing is obviously trying wherever possible to protect our older people from the virus. And secondly, those who work caring for older people, let's treat them with the utmost respect and let's protect them in the same way as we protect older people. Let's shield them, but not with social isolation. Let's actually treat them as total heroes, because actually they are the real unsung heroes, care workers. And let's make sure that we bring them to the front of the queue in supermarkets. Let's make sure they get the protective equipment, because I get letters from people everywhere saying they can't get protection. And let's give them the real number one, treatment and respect. Care workers, as well as health workers, need our respect. And as I've said before, I think that around 85 or 90% of care workers in the world are women, usually not on proper contracts, usually not with any kind of assurance. They're on what we call gig economy. They need to be properly employed. They need to be treated properly in terms of remuneration. If we're asking them to take responsibility in their private lives for their health, their own health, as well as the health of their charges, we need to reward them properly. That's not a political statement. That's a fact of life. Right now, they are invaluable to looking after our older people. We're asking them to make sacrifices. Let's also make sure that they get properly paid. Question 2, how long before we get a vaccine for COVID? Will it be available everywhere? This is a burning question. Why do we want a vaccine? Because a vaccine, if it's a good one, protects people against infection by a virus. I say if it's a good one. Not every disease caused by a virus is currently capable of being prevented through vaccination. 25 years ago, it was discovered that AIDS was caused by HIV. That's a virus. And it was discovered how desperate that disease is. And in particular, in poor countries, it's caused huge, huge challenges and continues to do so. Major cause of death among young women, particularly in Southern Africa. But we don't have a vaccine. Billions of dollars has been thrown at trying to produce it, but thrown in a very strategic way, but we don't have it. Or malaria, it's been around for years, and we've known about malaria for years, and there's been efforts to try to develop a malaria vaccine for years. We don't have a vaccine. Yes, for some diseases, we know what it takes to develop a vaccine. And the process, if we really fast forward everything, from finding the candidate that can become the vaccine, to then going through all the different phases of trials, they're called phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, making sure that it's effective, making sure that it's safe, and safety really matters. If you have a vaccine that causes side effects or causes death, it's a huge problem. We had one particular problem with a vaccine against a viral disease where it seemed that it caused extra side effects in people who had already had the disease. And so it was not usable. So checking all that out, minimum 18 months, but it could be much longer. So I'm saying to everybody, prepare to change your lives, make sure you can live with the COVID and have fun and make money and run your business and grow your food. But find a way to do it with the virus around. Don't wait for the vaccine to come because it could be a long wait. And there's a point that's in this question. If we get the vaccine, it's absolutely essential to make sure that it's available to everybody. Because actually, if the vaccine's good, if it's safe and effective, it's most needed in poor countries. It's most needed by health workers in poor countries. They are in the firing line. So I quite agree with the questioner. The vaccine needs to be available everywhere. And I am asking all the governments in the World Health Organization and other international bodies to come together now and to be thinking about the protocols they're going to use for when the vaccine is available, to make sure it gets to poor people. Because if they don't do it now and they wait till the vaccine is available, given that there's bound to be some argument and all that stuff, there always is when it comes to international things, it'd be too late to do it then. You'd be more delay. So get working out on the systems now. And I'm very pleased to say that a wonderful thing called the Vaccine Accelerator, the COVID Treatment and Vaccine Accelerator, was launched last Friday at the World Health Organization with lots of people involved. And the one great thing about that is they've gone straight into it saying, we want to be sure that the vaccine, when it's available, is available for everyone, regardless of who they are, where they are, how rich they are, what nation they belong to. And that is so important. That's public health values in practice. Question 3. Switzerland is reopening soon in stages. Schools to reopen on May the 11th. What would be the best way in ensuring social distancing between our students? Younger children may not be able to shoulder the self-responsibility that this entails. I do agree. We should not have one standard for the adult population and another standard for children. A, they won't understand it, and B, anyway, it's wrong. So it's important that wherever possible, efforts are made to help children to understand that there's something come along that means they have to keep distance from each other. I actually believe that, as with everybody, if you explain what this is about, if you explain that it's a virus that causes disease, if you explain how it's transmitted, and if you explain what's done to stop it being transmitted, and you stress that there are some people that we worry about more than others, so we have to pay special care with them, I think at least we can give them a chance of making sense of it. And they'll talk to each other and they'll find a way. They may not use words like virus or physical distancing or hand sanitizer. That may not be the language, but I actually think that just like all other forms of behavior that are important, like hygiene around any personal functions, I think this was something that will come to kids And so I accept that it'll be difficult. I accept that there's a lot of self-responsibility in here, but I have enormous confidence that teachers will find ways to help kids make sense of this. And that's what, in a way, it's going to be a joy and an excitement, because it is a process of collective discovery. And I think it will give us all huge opportunities for learning different ways of communicating, of developing our own visuals for describing it, our own animations, using that old style of where you put pictures in the corner of a book and flick through them, or all sorts of other ways of demonstrating to each other what we mean. And of course, song. And using song, I think, is really important. Question 4. What do I think is the likely impact of the virus on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? Lockdowns seem to have helped on pollution in the environment and have brought us closer to nature, but poverty and unemployment are through the roof. And the notion of a global solidarity and partnership between nations is nowhere in sight. So there's a lot in there. And my own view is that living with the threat of COVID in our midst and other viruses requires us to appreciate the power of what's in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Underlining that, there are 5 principles, which I'll share in a minute. But what I want to stress to you is that in order to cope with any issue of this kind, we really need to go back to the Sustainable Development Agenda, its principles, and the way in which it works in practice. And anything that you can do and I can do to remind people of the Sustainable Development Agenda will be helpful. Remember, the Sustainable Development Agenda is about people. It's about prosperity, and it's about partnering, and it's about, peace. And if we make certain, it was a big slip of mine, and it was because my brain wasn't fully focused on something that I ought to have deep in my mind. So I'll try it again. The Sustainable Development Agenda is about people, about prosperity, about partnership, about peace, and it's about the planet. And I think that over time, this is my belief, but it's coming to be more and more. Over time, there will be a growing recognition that the Sustainable Development Agenda and all it stands for is absolutely critical for societies to be able to live with the common threat of this virus. It's kind of bizarre that it could well be one factor that brings us much closer together, even though at the moment we see all sorts of positioning by politicians. There is a groundswell of understanding among humanity, as I've said in previous briefings, that recognize that it's only through working together that we're able to understand what's involved. And this is where Nazim's song, which you'll hear about because we will put it on our website, is so important, because it stresses that the only way to work with COVID is solidarity. And the fact that so many millions of people have already got that point, and more are getting it at an astronomical rate, makes me believe that we will actually be nudged into much greater solidarity in our human family by this. And thank you very much indeed for raising that point about the Sustainable Development Agenda. Question 5. There are very different death rates in Russia, China, Germany, India, compared with Italy, Spain, and USA. What factors make for such distinct variations? Now, this is a tricky question to unpack. It could be a bit of a quite long seminar, really. So I'm going to try to do it quickly. And if I leave you a bit confused, please forgive me. When you're working out death rates, basically you're saying here, what's the overall number of people who we know have got the disease, what we call the denominator, and what's the number of people who die, what we call the numerator. Now, the overall number of people with the disease, it depends hugely on how much testing is being done for COVID in the community. In many countries, only people with severe symptoms or health workers or people in very specific situations are being tested. You haven't got a full coverage of the population. And so if your testing is not very comprehensive, at least at the beginning, then your denominator may be small. Some countries only count some of their deaths. They count hospital deaths, but not deaths of old people in residential homes or not deaths of people outside hospital. And there are all sorts of issues around what do you say is a COVID death and a non-COVID death. So there are factors that affect the numerators as well, and they depend hugely on what's included and what's non-included. So I don't really want to say why certain countries are different from other countries, but I need to add in one other factor, which is the age structure of a population may have a huge impact on what proportion of people with COVID die. Older populations, there are more likely to be a lot of deaths. It's just the way it is. And so that is believed to be one of the reasons for quite high death rates in Italy and Spain, and even in the USA. In Germany, there's been quite widespread testing. And that's one of the reasons why it's thought that the death rate in Germany is lower. India, one of the thoughts is, again, the population age structure is different, but there are all sorts of other questions being asked about whether there are factors in the Indian population that might mean that they're less likely to die as a result of this virus. Watch this space. And China has had to actually adjust some of its Wuhan figures, the government of China, I mean, because they found that actually their early death rates were underestimated because they did not include some of these non-hospital COVID-related deaths. So that's why I do encourage you all not to read too much into different death rates. I know it's tempting to do so because there are both counting effects, what I call the numerator and denominator factors, and then there are also population and public health policy effects. So I hope you will accept that rather not clear answer. And by all means, do follow up with me personally, if you like, through contact@4sd.info, if you'd like more information on that. Question 6, are there any moves for an outcome from the World Health Assembly? That's the meeting of all governments that takes place to govern the World Health Organization, and that's next month in May. Are there any moves for an outcome from the World Health Assembly to go to the UN General Assembly? And the idea is that the World Health Assembly will send a message to the broader UN General Assembly, which meets in its big meeting in September, but can actually come together at any time. And what is there that this questioner would like to move from the health people to the UN General Assembly? The answer is increased coordination in its work to address the various impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the UN is actually already working under a mandate from the UN General Assembly from a meeting about 10 days ago, which gave the Secretary General very broad powers to bring together all of the United Nations system. That includes all the different UN agencies that for many of you are familiar names, together with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other bodies with all sorts of other names to work together using whatever resources are necessary to help countries to limit the impact of COVID-19. And there's a lot of work underway on everything from water and sanitation to unemployment, to food and nutrition, through on to peace and security and issues around women and women in COVID, disability, and much, much more. And that work is underway. But yes, I think it's right that there should be continued encouragement of the different parts of the United Nations system to coordinate so that they interconnect, as is done on the Sustainable Development Agenda. Because although at heart it is all a health issue, and dealing with the health issue is key to getting on top of it, it's actually leading to a cascade of outcomes and impacts that are due to interacting systems. And that means that the broader United Nations family has to work together on it. And I do believe that we're going to see a resolution coming out of the World Health Assembly on COVID. I haven't seen the dimensions of it, but I'm absolutely certain that I will highlight the broader consequences. Thanks for that question. Question 7. We know that health systems in Africa are much weaker, yet sub-Saharan Africa is a much younger continent, and sub-Saharan Africa is used to dealing with infectious diseases. How do I feel sub-Saharan Africa will be affected? Well, questioner who asked this question, you're actually reading into my mind. I've watched in my Ebola experience that I mentioned at the beginning, that actually there are communities in the forested region of Guinea called Guinea Forestière and the inland area of Liberia and Sierra Leone, and also the part of Mali that comes into that area around Liberia and Sierra Leone. I've forgotten the name of the river. It just was on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, what I want to stress is that what we saw there was that communities knew about infectious diseases. They showed me sometimes a particular hut in the village, which would be the place where a person with fever and any other symptoms might be asked to go for a bit. Food would be brought to their door and they'd have their own space, the latrine and so on, but they would be isolated because that village knew that when you've got contagion, you have to ask people to isolate. You make them the hero. You give them a lot of special food and other goodies, but you basically ask them to be on their own until either they get better or they die. And I do think that this approach has been a very, very important approach for centuries in many developing countries. And also, of course, before we got into this modern way of working, it was the case here. And we had isolation hospitals and facilities all over Europe for a long, long time. So I do think that this is a very powerful aspect of community responsiveness. I also agree with you that the relative young age may make a difference. And I'm still hopeful that we won't have the level of death that we've seen in Western Europe and the US. But at the same time, there are other factors such as perhaps less good nutrition and other concomitant infections that might make people in sub-Saharan Africa much more vulnerable. And this virus, it's so new and it's always giving us nasty surprises. So I am just not banking on anything. And when I listen to Francis Casolo, who leads the WHO emergency program in the Africa region, and he describes to me some of the terrible challenges that he's seeing from several countries in his region where large numbers of deaths are being reported, I just am still very, very, very worried indeed. So I like you, I'm hopeful that the effect won't be so bad. I'm also constantly anxious and constantly calling on wealthier nations. Yes, look after yourselves, but remember, there's a whole world of more than 5.5 billion people, developing countries and middle-income countries who are hurting much, much worse. And we really must show solidarity with them. After all, they didn't ask for this virus. It's just arrived. None of us asked for this virus. It's just arrived. We've all got to get solidarity going. Question 8. Many people who live in lower resource communities suffer from mental illness. How can we improve outreach to these individuals? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody making sense of this virus is also everybody in various ways experiencing massive mood swings, real sense of anxiety, of stress, of concern, of worry, money, food, seeing my relatives, who's going to look after me? And then anybody who's already got a lot of stress, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, perhaps even some personality challenges, this just compounds them. So people with existing mental illness are really, really finding this tough. I think mostly, I'm just trying to think, is everybody? But yeah. And secondly, People who are not mentally ill are still enormously stressed by this, enormously stressed. And that's why solidarity in community and tolerance and support and understanding and respect is so important. Just because somebody's having a bad time with this and perhaps finding it hard in big press conferences to say things that make total sense, we shouldn't necessarily find ourselves being very critical. We all have to be supportive of each other as we're trying to come to terms with this. We all have to be supportive of those who, even in public places, are finding it hard to come to terms with it. This is a big stress for every one of us, whoever we are, and we all need to be supported through it. We need a huge amount of tolerance and respect. And in that regard, being mentally strong and connected to our resources and being able to deal with issues as they arise is so, so important. And I think having that tolerance, having that willingness to accept that this is stressful for everybody and it challenges their value systems is really essential. So outreach to people who are stressed is a job for all of us, in our families, in our communities. Question 9, please share your thoughts on the role of peacekeeping. Peacekeepers are as stretched as they have ever been. If troop contributing countries withdraw their troops, the opportunities for peace may be shattered for generations. Thank you for this question. Thank you for anticipating where this virus might lead us. It's what I call cascading systems impacts. And it's happening in so many different areas. And we need to play it through and work it through and think it through and be kind to each other as we think it through and come to appreciate its meaning, even though it stresses us when we're in public as well as when we're in private. This is a specific challenge. The whole global peacekeeping system depends on troops provided on a voluntary basis by nations all over the world. The troops get paid for coming and volunteering to be peacekeepers, but they can be withdrawn by the countries that provide these troops at a moment's notice if there is a need domestically to have the troops back. This is a reality. And because COVID is so challenging and is going to get more challenging in the coming weeks and months throughout our world, it's really, really important that we understand that troops contributing countries will be under pressure to bring troops home. And that in turn will create major, major insecurity for communities already stressed by the effect of COVID, then being without peacekeepers there. Peacekeepers who are keeping the lid on simmering conflict that can burst into violence at any time. This is massive. That's why the Secretary General of the UN appealed for ceasefires everywhere. Question 10, do I think there is sufficient personal protective equipment for health workers globally? No. If whatever there is, so I'm changing the question, how can whatever there is be shared in an equitable fashion to countries where it's needed most? Answer, this is something the World Health Organization has taken on board with the suppliers, with distributing companies, with governments, supported by different parts of the UN, particularly UNICEF, which has the best procurement capacity, the World Food Programme, which has the best airline and logistic capacity, connecting in through the World Health Organization Center. This is an essential global function, and one of the reasons why we have a World Health Organization. And yes, more work is being done to make that work. And thank you to those of you who are connected to that whole global supply system. I thank you. You're working 24/7, and this is incredible work. I would like to single out individuals, but that would be wrong. Question 11. Why do countries seem to be so unprepared for this, even though pandemics have happened before? They've been warned. It was very high on the list of risks, but it just didn't happen to fit in to where they were putting their preparedness funds. Simple as that. 1 or 2 countries kept their preparedness going. They're the ones that are doing best. There are also countries that had SARS. That was a massive dress rehearsal. I don't think we'll ever be unprepared again, not at least within our lifetimes. This has got so much further to go. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thanks for participating in the earlier part where we talked about resource poor settings, the middle where we talked a bit about 4SD, the latter part where we reacted to your questions, trying to weave in the different points. We'll go on, we'll try to interpret the guidance to you, we'll try to explain what we see is happening, we'll try to encourage tolerance as decision makers struggle with impossibly difficult choices and themselves are coming to terms with what is going on. And we'll try to work with you, most importantly, so that we can reach communities everywhere and support them, not just to deal with the COVID, but also to emerge from this with stronger, more progressive, and indeed more sustainable and equitable systems for all. We believe in the power of humanity, and we thank you for sharing with us in this quest. Bye-bye.